Linda Darling-Hammond, it's good to have you here at the University of Melbourne, having lured you away from Stanford, albeit for a brief period.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Let's start by talking about educational standards, because I think it's fair to say that both the United States and Australia are expressing a fair bit of national anxiety about a decline in standards across key subject areas. You're in the position where over a long period you have been looking at what works and what doesn't work when you push on the reform agenda. So I'd be interested in where you think the US is at right now on that spectrum.
Well, the US has, there's no generalization you can make because it's such a big place, it's very decentralized, et cetera. So we have some of the best practice in the world, some of the most exciting and innovative things. And then we have places where the conditions for schools are very poor. Our big issues are equity, number one, huge inequality in the population in terms of income and opportunity, exacerbated by inequality in school funding, where the rich get more and the poor get less. And so that's, a critical issue for us. We're coming out of an era of accountability-based testing systems that were, under No Child Left Behind, intended to drive achievement and close the achievement gap. Pisa results show that we've flatlined over this decade. It has not moved us that far forward.
So No Child Left Behind has really produced a very mixed record?
Yeah, I would say it mixed at best. It has narrowed the curriculum. The problem with No Child Left Behind was not the intentions, very noble intentions, to pay attention to all groups of students, aim for closing the achievement gap, and try to encourage schools to meet, continuous improvement targets. But the vehicle that was chosen, which was every child, every year, multiple choice testing, ended up narrowing and dumbing down the curriculum. There was much too little attention paid to the capacity building needed, so testing without investing doesn't get you all that far. It did not address the inequalities in funding, the inequalities in access to qualified teachers, and so on. So while I do think it produced an agreement in the country that we should be paying attention to the achievement of all students, and that we should be deliberately working to close the achievement gap, we are now at a point where alternatives are obviously needed, and we need to do several things, I think, in most people's minds. One is to really return to a robust, intellectually challenging curriculum, not a multiple choice curriculum that is just very focused on low-level skills. We've got to address the equity issue in terms of the resources, and we've got to continue to build more assertively professional capacity to do the work, because standards do not teach themselves. And we will see that. I mean, there's definitely that conversation in Australia. Clearly, it's been learned in the United States. Words on paper are nice. They can make you think about what you might do, but if you don't know how to do it, you don't have the resources to do it, and you haven't organized the schools to do it, they won't get you far enough.
The issue of inequality, of course, has been highlighted by President Obama in quite a number of recent speeches. But I mean, overall, how do you judge the Obama years? I mean, certainly when he came to office, I would have thought there were very high expectations that he would engineer some kind of turnaround.
Obama has had some great accomplishments, to be sure. In the education sphere, I would say one of the greatest is attending to reinvesting in financial aid for higher education and, focusing attention on expanding opportunities in that space. But given the politics of the time, given the economic challenges that he walked in on and many other political factors, we have not made any gains on equity in school funding in these last years. He did appoint a commission on equity. I sat on it with many other folks in the United States. And we said once again that we have to start to get funding to follow the needs of the child. There are states that are making progress on that, like California. But as a rule, the United States as a whole has not taken on that. I would say that we're finally getting to the issue of early childhood education. unfortunately at a time when our Congress is dysfunctional and cannot get anything done.
And yet this is remarkable because some of the best research that you can look at on early childhood intervention comes out of the United States.
Absolutely.
And has done so for decades.
Absolutely. And we have states that have demonstrated without a doubt that when you invest in high quality early childhood experiences, especially for the children who are coming in with less opportunity in the home and community for learning, that you have dramatic improvements in closing the achievement gap before school begins, in reducing grade retention, school failure, dropouts, incarceration, unemployment. The economic benefits to early childhood education, we've got study after study, are very, very high. For every dollar you invest, you reap something like $10 in returns to the society. So we have good examples. Some whole states are doing it. But as a nation yet, we have not taken up the challenge to make sure that that's universally available.
Tell me about that those states and districts where you work and places that are seeing a turnaround in performance, what are some of the common features that they're undertaking?
One of the things that you can look at are both states that some years ago undertook an approach to standards-based reform that was successful, and some states more recently that have done it. And let me just give you two examples. One is our top-ranking state on every measure, and that's Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts has a pretty highly educated population, but it was not always at the head of the pack in terms of educational performance. In the early 1990s, they put in place a school funding reform that allocated more money to follow the child, with more money for children in poverty, English learners, and others who needed more support. They enacted standards that were very thoughtful, not unlike the kind of standards reflected in the new national curriculum in Australia. They followed that up with very thoughtful, open-ended assessments, not just multiple choice, fill in the bubble. They invested in preschool across the whole state, child health, and professional development for teachers and school administrators. They very quickly rose to be one of the highest performing states because they did a systemic approach. And that's what we see in other countries, Singapore, Finland, and other places.
It's the range of things they do.
It's doing it, it's saying adequately resourced schools, well-educated and supported educators who know what to do, and strategies to ensure that those who have less learning opportunity, perhaps at home and in the community, get more of it in early childhood and education. New Jersey more recently did that, and they propelled themselves as a very racially and ethnically and economically diverse state to #1 in the nation in writing. Same strategies.
And is there a consciousness, as there is in those top performing countries, that once enacted, then you have to be consistent about applying those policies?
We have trouble with that in the United States.
So do we.
Certainly in Massachusetts, 15 years, 20 years of work on that front. And we hope New Jersey will stay the course and others will follow. But yes, in high performing systems, they take a systemic approach and they just improve on that base year after year, decade after decade. Very, very important to stay the course.
One of the points you've been making in the books you've written recently is that teaching is still not regarded as a profession, as a body, a profession that has an agreed body of knowledge and a precise practice. We're still struggling with that, aren't we?
Well, we're struggling with whether teaching has the social supports and mechanisms of professions. We do have a knowledge base, and that has become clearer and clearer. In the late 1990s, the National Academy of Sciences issued a volume in the United States called How People Learn, and it assembled all that we know about how people learn, which is really extensive now. And some years later, a few years later, the National Academy of Education issued a volume on how to prepare teachers based on what we've learned about successful preparation for teachers and the kind of teaching that produces high quality learning. We actually know a huge amount. The question is, how do you make sure that it is enacted in preparation for teachers, in professional learning, in standards, in qualifications, and in all of those other mechanisms that societies use.
And presumably the knowledge is shared
Yes.
within the schools and across schools.
Absolutely. The three features of a profession: there's a common body of knowledge and skills that is acknowledged and that is expected to be shared across everyone. There's a commitment to the welfare of the client, the moral commitment, the ethical commitment to do what's right for the client based on that knowledge, and a commitment to define, transmit, and enforce those standards of practice writ large. You can't just do what feels good to you because it's what you saw your teacher do 20 years ago, or it feels right to you, and not engage in learning the professional knowledge. So to do that, this is where the professionalization agenda has to create strong standards for the preparation of people coming into the profession, indicators that they've met those standards when they come in, that there is an expectation of opening up the practice, the classrooms, for continual review, evaluation, and the ongoing learning is provided so that people get better.
Do you still come across stories in the US in particular states, particular districts, where in fact the opposite happens, that teachers pretty much are left alone in the classroom and they're doing the best they can, but often on the basis of some knowledge but a lot of intuition?
Absolutely. We have states that have pursued a professional agenda and have done all the things I just described. We have states that have done very little of it or have even undone it after they got started. And so we have places where people come into teaching all different ways. Some people have training, some people don't. They may or may not be prepared in their content area. They may or may not know anything about how to teach it effectively. We have districts where there's very little professional learning opportunity and where the standards for entry and continuation are not very well enforced. And where you have that set of conditions, you typically have pretty low achievement and big achievement gaps.
So what about teacher evaluation? Because this comes to the topic of your lecture at the University of Melbourne this week. What is effective?
Well, number one, you need good assessment in pre-service and at the end of pre-service before you enter. You can't wait till people get into the occupation and say, now we'll sort out whether you know what to do. The strong professions, medicine, law, engineering, and so on, have strong assessment before you get in the profession. And so there should be evaluation of preparation programs and what they do and what they're producing. There should be evaluation of beginning teachers before they enter, sort of like we would think of as a bar exam in the law or a medical licensing exam. We use in the United States now, many states, started with California where I am, a performance assessment for beginning teachers where they actually demonstrate that they can plan and teach a curriculum and produce student learning and evaluate that learning, and they put it in a portfolio and it gets assessed by trained evaluators, and that's very transformative for the candidates and the preparation institutions. Then you have to think about evaluation when you get into the occupation, and there you need both standards-based observations of the practice, what's going on in the classroom, what the plans and student work look like, and all of those things. And you need to begin to assemble thoughtful evidence of student learning that goes along with the evidence of practice. So in the best cases, teachers are assembling a portfolio of evidence about what their kids have learned over time, from the beginning to the end of the year or the beginning to the end of a unit, as well as what they themselves are doing to encourage that learning, to give the right kind of feedback, to put the right kind of instructional strategies in place. Where you have that happening in a developmental way, where the accountability is explicitly about improvement, you see tremendous school-wide improvements, particularly if teachers are talking about and helping each other figure out how to improve their practice together and develop evidence of learning together and look at that evidence together.
If I could switch now to the question of student assessment and the whole issue of national testing, which of course has been adopted in Australia in the last couple of years. I gather you take a rather dim view of Australia's NAPLAN testing. Why is that?
Well, I am a big fan of some of the assessments that Australians have produced, and I use in my own work because we're borrowing. We believe in R&D, rip off and disseminate. So we borrow a lot from the qualifications assessment systems in places like Queensland and Victoria, ACT, New South Wales. Students there are doing, sometimes there's a sit-down test but it's often open-ended essays where students have to explain and defend their thinking and analyze and evaluate and do complex problem solving. And it's coupled with project-based evaluations in the classroom where students may have to design and conduct a science investigation, write up the results, evaluate their data, understand whether it will replicate or generalize, and so on. Those kinds of assessments are developing what we think of as deeper learning, 21st century learning skills that are really focused at the higher end intellectual capacities and the personal capacities to be able to be resilient and persevering and engage in serious work. The NAPLAN I know has a useful intention. It looks a lot like a US test. It is predominantly a set of multiple choice items where you pick one right answer out of 5. And I don't think that it goes far enough to draw on the benefits of what Australia has already produced in its secondary programs. That ought to be migrating its way into the middle and primary schools.
So you'd argue it's data that is not telling us very much.
It's not telling you nearly enough about kids' capacities to engage in higher order thinking and performance. It tells you about whether they can pick one answer out of 5. And when you teach around a test like that, a lot of the instruction then becomes, how do you learn to guess effectively? How do you eliminate the wrong answer and, tease out the others? That's not instruction around content. That's instruction around test taking. It would not be a huge problem if you did nothing with the results other than sort of, look at them briefly and say, okay. But if you start to tie decisions to results around tests that are not actually very intellectually rigorous and reflective of your broader standards, then the curriculum starts to go in that direction. So my concern with the NAPLAN is that there is a lot of talk about attaching things to it, and it is not as robust an assessment tool as the assessments that Australia has already developed. So I'd love to see, with the new national curriculum, that the assessments begin to become more thoughtful and robust from primary all the way through secondary. I think you need to be preparing kids for that rigorous set of expectations. They may not get from here to there if they're focused on pick one answer out of 5, all the way up until they get to high school and all of a sudden they're supposed to be engaged in this very rigorous critical thinking.
Of course, the tests that are regarded as very robust are the international Pisa and Pearls tests. Yeah. And alarmingly, Australian performance has been dropping with both an equity gap, but of course our brightest students since 2000 are not performing as well. What does that suggest to you? That there's too much teaching to the middle, that we are not challenging our best students? What's going on, do you think?
It could be that NAPLAN is actually implicated in that. I don't know that for a fact, but Pisa is 2/3 of the items on Pisa are open-ended items where students have to analyze some information and present and defend an idea and apply it to a new situation. That's what we call transfer. You go beyond what the problem is and you transfer that information to something else. And even a higher gold standard is the International Baccalaureate Assessment, which looks remarkably like the best of the secondary assessments in Australia that I just described. If you're focusing kids not on that kind of way of demonstrating their learning, then they're not likely to acquire those ways of demonstrating their learning. And you may raise the bottom, but you may not be able to reach the top because there's not enough of the work and not enough of the accountability and not enough of the focus on those higher order thinking and performance skills. So I think the other issue for Australia and Pisa is deepening inequality. Australia became less equitable in some ways over a period of years, partly I think because of the differences among the sectors not necessarily within the government sector. And equity in the allocation of resources turns out to be one of the biggest drivers for the steeply improving nations on Pisa in the 2012 results.
I'd just like to turn to one final and I think really fascinating question for education this century, and that is, what is the debate around what it takes to be an educated person in the 21st century? I mean, with what we know about much greater specialization, much greater complexity, a labor market that is just transforming before our eyes, how do you train the next generation?
Of teachers?
No,
or
well, I'm
kids?
thinking of students, but teachers as well, that's true.
Well, they're both obviously implicated. Well, one thing about the expectations for students is that the most important skill for them is going to be learning to learn. And I sometimes tell a little story, which I, as a Stanford professor, feel a little guilty about because it's research done by Berkeley people, but and that's our big rival. But there are some people looking there at the growth of knowledge in the world, and they found that between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. You think about that. Technology knowledge is doubling every year at this point. It's not going to be enough to say, here's a set of facts, memorize the facts, spit them back to me, divide them up into the 12 years of schooling, you've done that, and then you're done. The young people we have are going to have to solve problems that we have created for them and can barely frame with knowledge that hasn't been invented yet, technologies that haven't been discovered yet. They're going to have to be able to take what they know and continually acquire, evaluate, use new knowledge, and invent new things. That means we cannot do a transmission curriculum, which just says, okay, people learned this a long time ago, we're telling it to you, you're going to remember it and tell it back to us. We have to teach them to be able to work in the world on acquiring and making sense of and inventing and being creative. So that's a huge shift in the expectations for schools. It also means we need teachers and school leaders who themselves can think in those ways and can teach a curriculum in a way that allows kids to do a lot of inquiry while they're learning the facts and concepts, so that habit of inquiry, that habit of thinking creatively and discovering and making sense of and so on is so deeply ingrained that the students that we have today greatly exceed us in their capacity for problem solving.
And of course, all of that you've described is a long way from some of the current political debates.
Indeed it is, and we're all a creature of our current times. But I do think that there is a growing awareness that the world is changing at such a rapid clip that schools need to be envisioning a new future. We've got to use the tools we have, the curriculum tools, the professional learning tools, the incentives for innovation that we can muster to, on the one hand, enable an even starting field for all of our kids, and on the other, to really liberate schools to be able to pursue a future that is only partly in view.
Linda Darling-Hammond, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you've enjoyed your time in Australia.
I have. It's been terrific.